Have you ever used aloe vera to soothe sunburnt skin?
Yes.
Have you ever had a medical syringe used on you, perhaps at the dentist or at the doctor's?
Yes.
Have you ever eaten an oyster?
Yes.
Have you ever taken Panadol?
Yes.
And have you ever been in an elevator? Now you may be wondering, where is this kid going with this? And I'd like you to imagine life without some of these items. These important everyday items have one big connection. What if I told you that all of these items are derived from Indigenous knowledge and its methods? Now I understand that may not mean much, so let me explain. Indigenous Africans used solicin from dog bark trees, a natural chemical compound used to treat muscle pains, the same chemical which we use in many anti-inflammatory pills today. Indigenous Africans use aloe vera to protect their skin from the harsh sun, the same plant which we use in many of the bottles of lotion today. Now the Comanche, the indigenous peoples of America, used bird meat bones attached to animal bladders as syringes, the first pre-modern example of a syringe we use in hospitals today. The Olmecs, the indigenous peoples of Mexico, used pulleys to raise totem poles, the same pulleys which we use in elevator mechanisms and theatre curtains today. Even the way we farm shellfish and oysters has been derived from methods indigenous East Coast Salish people in British Columbia have used for centuries. It's a common misconception that indigenous knowledge is outdated, although a closer look only reveals that many of our modern practices boil down to ancient knowledge. Indigenous knowledge has not only propelled us into modern methods, but can still teach us to make better informed decisions, specifically in relation to pressing environmental challenges. On Monday the 3rd of July this year, the Earth recorded its hottest ever temperature at 16.2 degrees. 2 days later, it broke its own record at 17.18 degrees. Only to set the record higher 2 more times that same week. In Aotearoa, there's undeniable evidence that our tile is suffering from global warming, pollution, and commercialization of our natural environment. To see how an indigenous lens can help us move forward, we must first understand the benefits that it provides. You see, there's a time and place for both Western science and indigenous knowledge, and it's crucial that we understand where to apply each. Now there are 3 messages, 3 values set in indigenous knowledge that I want you to take away today. A few weeks ago, I spent a day with a group of environmental ambassadors. We walked the path of the Kumototo stream, a stream that runs through the city we are in now, Pōneke. Now the stream's been culverted, which means piped or covered up. It's invisible to the human eye because buildings and roads are built over it. At some point during our walk, we stopped to talk about the stream. Being brought up in Western education and therefore having a Western understanding of science, what I saw was an underground stream. The thought of water flowing through a pipe was pretty boring, and that's why I was surprised to hear my mentor share his perspective, informed by an indigenous upbringing and the insight that that provided. This was a moment that has forever changed the way I see nature. He spoke of the stream as a living ecosystem. He told us stories about the crayfish, eels, and bullyfish, which lived in these small city pipes, barely getting by, but still surviving. He spoke about mauri mate, for something to be sick, and told us about how our street runoff and stormwater drains lead into the same pipes which carry this stream from mountain to sea. He spoke of the interconnectedness of the stream and its role in the surrounding environment. He spoke about how it's connected to us. And then he said this, and I want you to listen very carefully to this. He said, the stream wasn't a brick composite lined in polyvinyl chloride with H2O running through at 2 parts per million. It was a living, breathing, integral part of the land, of us. At that point, I realized that I was so naive. My Western lens didn't allow me to recognize the significance of the stream, yet alone, I was oblivious to the fact that it was dying. It was under the ground. Who cares what's down there, right? Here we come to understand our first difference from Western science. Indigenous knowledge is holistic and does not alienate our environment. Indigenous knowledge was mainly formed to survive, whereas Western science grew out of a need to feed their curiosity and to capitalize development. Because of this, Indigenous knowledge has a distinct link to responding to environmental factors. This helps form an appreciation towards nature and a respect for a force that's much bigger than us. In Te Ao Māori, there's a word kaitiakitanga. It emphasizes the idea of being guardians to our land. My mentor was a kaitiaki. We should never be seen as taking, but only borrowing and exchanging from the land. By adopting Indigenous methods, we can ensure that we start caring a whole lot more about our actions, their consequences, and our taiao. Now, I want to continue this story, because later the same day, we carried out some water testing on this river. Now you see, there are so many types of water testing gear laid out for us to use. I was amazed. Nitrate strips, cage strips, clarity tubes, and all sorts of equipment. Although, before I could get my hands on any of them, my mentor asked me to stop. He asked me to wade into the water and close my eyes. So now I invite you all to close your eyes. He said, can you feel the temperature of the water? Is it warm or is it cold? Can you smell the air? Is it dense? Is it clean? Can you feel how fast the stream is flowing? Let it run between your fingers. And if you open your eyes, you may open your eyes. Can you see through the water? Is it clear? Is it murky? A technique used by Māori for centuries to check on the health of a stream working in the present. Although we don't end up with specific measurements, we end up with roughly the same knowledge. In Aotearoa, Māori have been listening to environmental cues for centuries. When the moon is in phase, it's time to plant the crops. We call it circannual rhythms. It's also maramataka. You see, when the pahuta kaua are out in full bloom, the kina are juicy. We call it mutualist patterns. It's also just a way of observation. Here we come to understand our second message. Indigenous knowledge is fundamental at heart. It values simplicity over complication. We as a society have made a great misstep in our collective decision to overcomplicate our understanding of Western science. Undoubtedly, Western science is needed to research complex ideas because, simply, it's more technically developed. Although where we can, Indigenous knowledge will help us to foster a strong sense of connection to our work and enable us to keep sight of the overall picture. We cannot let compartmentalization and labeling be a barrier to stopping us understanding all aspects of our work. Now lastly, let's draw our attention to the fact that both Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge can be science. Let's take the example of a umu, as they call it in the Pacific Islands, or a hangi here. After repetition, analysis, observation, and adaptation, Pacific cultures have learned how to cook using the earth. You see, volcanic rocks with porous qualities are used to absorb heat. Banana leaves are soaked in water to induce evaporation or combustion. and then clay is lined on the inside of the umu to reflect heat waves. Now I ask you, what about this is not science? As I pointed out earlier, we use Indigenous knowledge every day, although some still don't accept Indigenous knowledge in science. We start to ask ourselves, when did respecting Western science and acknowledging Indigenous knowledge become mutually exclusive ideas? When we can differentiate both bodies of knowledge and respect them, we can set a precedent for healthy relationships and representation of our Indigenous communities. Aloe vera, a medical syringe, an oyster, Panadol, and an elevator. One connection, and now you know what it is. One connection, my thoughts and knowledge passed down to you. One connection, I hope you do not forget. Let's incorporate Indigenous people into our early decision making, into environmental hui, and into our big decisions. Let's respect and recognize the significance of Indigenous knowledge, because it's really now or never. Thank you.